Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Worth, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Quorum, and excited to do today's webinar about measuring the ROI of government affairs. A little bit of background about this presentation has come from a long-standing questions that we have gotten over the course of the last 5 years of starting Quorum about, is it possible to measure the return on investment of government affairs? How are other teams doing it? What are the best ways to do it? And how might you bring that to your organizations? The impetus for putting this presentation together is that we got asked to come and speak to a roundtable of about 20 heads of government affairs offices on this exact topic, and so shared a variation of this presentation with them. And what we wanted to do was take the opportunity and share it with a broader audience of people who would also be interested in it and who might find value with their organizations. What we're going to cover today are a series of 6 different strategies for measuring the return on investment of government affairs. The intention for this is to give you a menu of options that you are able to choose from in looking at different ways to bring metrics and measurement to your work, and realizing that you may find one or two of these really interesting and that you want to go and put into action. You may hate one, you may love another, and that's perfectly fine. But what this encapsulates is the best practices that we've seen across both our clients as well as some of our potential clients and in the industry, and seen at many of the different conferences and roundtables and discussions of how people across the government and public affairs sector have taken to bringing measurement to their work. This should run about 30 minutes or so, that we'll cover the 6 different ways, and then we'll have time for questions at the end to engage in discussion as well. So today's webinar, what we're going to do, we'll talk a little bit about the challenge, the 6 strategies, and then that audience Q&A. So the long-standing challenge that we are trying to address with this is finding metrics that show the return on government affairs that are both informative and actionable. One of the things that we know very well as a business, and that you all likely have seen with some of the other departments at your nonprofit, association, or company, is that those units come back and have a very clear way of proving their return on investment, oftentimes with a specific dollar amount, where they can say, we went and invested Y amount of money and that returned X amount, and therefore that was a return on investment of a given percentage. And oftentimes that has become harder to do in government affairs for a variety of reasons. And so figuring out whether or not it's that end result or what different inputs actually truly lead to that ideal return on investment. We've seen 6 different strategies for measuring the return on investment of government affairs. We'll talk about it from a dollars perspective, like a preferred legislative outcomes, talk about stakeholder scoring, meeting tracking informed by data, the correlation between engagement and legislative activity, and then finally conclude with a more qualitative multi-factor point system. So I'm going to jump right into it by starting with the first main one, and this is obviously the best, is it is most similar to what other units in an organization would be doing, and that is being able to measure the financial impact of government affairs. So the end goal that you're looking for here is, we will able to return X millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars to the business or organization, to our members, or save X or Y given amount of money. Now, a couple of examples of what this looked like in practice. The first is an organization that we have seen that has an Excel model, and what they are is they're a household goods company, and in their Excel model they have every single unit and product that they produce, the exact number of those units that they sell a given year, and the cost to those. And what they do is they take any new policy, whether it be a potential regulation, a tariff, a state piece of legislation, a bill in Congress, and they use it to determine the economic impact that that piece of policy would end up having on their ability to sell a given product. And because they have all that information right in front of them, their government affairs team then is actually able to go in and determine that this would potentially jeopardize $200,000 or $2.3 million of business. And then what they've done internally is set a given percentage that they're willing to spend to prevent that specific issue from occurring. So for them, I think it ends up being around 2 or 3% of the total financial impact, so that they know just how big of a risk it is and how much money they should be spending, either on their team internally to fight against it, to fund a trade association or coalition or advocacy group, or whether it's just simply not worth the major effort to turn and fight against that given policy. The other side that we've seen this done, and this is the more common way, is partnering with an internal business unit, or partnering, if you're an association, with member companies, or on the nonprofit side, you probably have to find a way to have somebody actually be able to model it, but is using an external party to be able to go and calculate the financial impact. So we work with a Fortune 100 company who every policy that's introduced, they take back to the business unit and ask the business unit to project the calculated projected impact that piece of legislation or policy outcome would have on the business. And they'll get back a wide range numbers of, well, if this happens, it'll cost the business $10 million. If we're able to prevent this, we could save $5 million. Or by this piece of legislation passing, we might create $20 million of new economic opportunity that comes with that. And what it allows the individual unit and business unit to do is actually go and be able to have an entire list of here are the policies they care about, here's the projected impact, and be able to sum and tally that up at the end of the day. So they have that very clear number of here's how much we've been able to generate or save when it comes to return on investment. Now, a fun best practice here is to actually get the business unit to pay for the government affairs efforts. So we work with two major companies that have very significant government affairs teams. And what they're able to do is they'll ask the business unit for what's the projected economic and anticipated impact that a given policy would have. The business unit will come back and say, well, that could bring us $10 million in new business opportunities. And the government affairs team will say, well, great. How much is it worth to you to try and get that to happen? The business unit would say, well, we'll spend $2 million to make that happen. Of the $2 million in total, the business unit will then pay the government affairs team so that they can go and invest that in efforts to make that given policy come to life. And this is a big reason why these teams have ended up being some of the largest that we've seen and worked with, is that they're able to get a lot more support from across the rest of the organization and get that additional funding. So how might you bring this back to your organization? Well, the main part is you need to start tracking the issues that you care about and have a list, whether that's in a Word document, Excel, in a Quorum-like platform, maybe it's a SharePoint, of the issues that you care about. To clearly assign the dollar value to each issue, you'll need to, of course, figure out, and the hard part is what is that dollar value, and then track the policy outcome and see, was that policy outcome realized? If it was that new economic opportunity that was created, or was that a harm that's prevented? And summing up at the end of the day, you can actually get a specific number of here's the total value that we were able to bring back to the business unit. So that's the first way to do it. We have to start there, as that's really, truly the best practice, is that if you can get a financial result, then you can be able to determine, talk about ROI as many other organizations and business units will be talking about. Now, the big challenge that we see most of our clients run into is the world in that they're not actually able to get for every single policy that happens a specific dollar value of economic impact that policy would have. Simply, there's too many given bills, too many issues, too many things working on, and they don't want to ask the business unit to consistently be running all these analyses where they don't have that wonderful spreadsheet that clearly articulates. And this is where the next four strategies are to look at other ways of bringing metrics to look at the inputs and then seeing how you're able to change those inputs from year to year as it comes to return on investment. So the second strategy is looking at the rate of preferred legislative outcomes. This works particularly well when you're dealing with lots of pieces of legislation. And so our state legislative clients we see do this most often and have the best success with it. But what happens with this is that every single year, as people are going through and tracking legislation, they're putting individual tags on that legislation. And if we just go back the slide here, maybe it's that they support, oppose it, or just watching the legislation, they assign a priority to it, they tag it to a given issue area that's relevant on that issue, or assign it to another series of categories that may be a given tier, a policy priority or business priority that it relates to. And what they're able to do is then be able to look back and here we are in 2019, looking at our 2018 results, and very quickly pull of all the bills that we reviewed and tracked, 68 of those we opposed, 112 we supported, and 43 of them we're just watching. But then the question becomes, well, what happened to those pieces of legislation? So of the bills that we worked on and opposed, 68 of those bills in total, 69% of them failed and 31% of them passed. So we did a fairly good job in this case, in this hypothetical example, at killing legislation. Of the bills that we worked on and supported, 55% passed and 45% failed. So in this case, we did a slightly better job and a better ratio of getting those bills passed, but still had a lot of pieces of legislation that ended up failing. We also can then break it down by the issues that we saw the most success on. So if you break down every bill by an issue area, because you're naturally going through and tagging that as you go, we can see in this case that our organization had a fair amount of trouble with energy and environment, where lots of those issue areas and bills in those issue areas were failures. But when it came to trade and labor, had a lot more success in terms of moving bills and getting those passed on trade and labor issues, starting to give some results to be able to then share back with the organization around this is how we're doing, and this is where we're having successes and where we're having failures. But the true really magic of this comes in being able to compare the results year over year. And this begins, and you can do this both with the overall statistics as is shown in this slide, or with the specific issue area breakdowns that we saw previously, where you've got a series of the individual data and you can compare year over year. So in this case, we can see, did the work lead to the preferred legislative outcome? Well, of the bills that we were tracking, only 69% of those we opposed, 55% we supported compared to 63, and we would just end up watching more legislation in 2018 than we did in 2017. And so doing these comparisons year over year will allow you to get a sense of, all right, of the efforts that we're putting into place, are we actually moving that needle, and are we seeing better results than we have in previous years? So how to do this? Well, one of the first things is you have to use a system for legislative tracking. And the big part of this is that you're pulling, again, all this data that you're putting into the system over the course of the year. You're probably dealing with a couple hundred pieces of legislation, and so you need to have some sort of organized way to do that. Then as each bill comes forward, it needs to be tagged by the issue, by the stance, by the priority that it relates to. And then the third part of it is then you need to be reporting on those trends and pulling it together into those presentations. An example of what some of that reporting can easily look like is simply breaking that down by stance of the bills worked on, by the current status of where they are in the process, by the issues that they related to, or by that organization priority, and where it is made really easy to be able to determine that information and quickly pull those reports. So this is the second big strategy. Really helpful when you've got lots of pieces of legislation, and also because at the end of the day, looking at that outcome of, did that legislation move, did the legislation not move, and how did that change year over year? This strategy becomes a little bit more difficult to implement when you are simply only addressing a couple of issues a year, and where those issues are changing. So if you're dealing with 5 and you've got 1 regulatory, 1 legislative, 1 state legislative, it's hard to measure that year over year, as opposed to state legislative level if you're dealing with 200 bills. So certainly another outcome and potential strategy to consider. The third strategy to talk about is moving away from the financial outcomes, from the legislative outcomes, and start talking about people, realizing at the core of government and public affairs work comes down to those individual stakeholders, whether this is a mayor, city council member, maybe a state legislator, governors, attorney generals, member of Congress, member of the administration, and stakeholder scoring. This comes from a Fortune 100 client of ours who wanted to be able to look at that question and had the request that come down from the C-suite of, are our efforts actually moving the needle at the end of the day? And are we able to go in and get people and have them have a more positive impression of the business? So 2 different ways to break down stakeholder scoring systems. One of the ways that's long been talked about in the research is just a more descriptive measure of the relationship with that stakeholder. So the most basic one being, knows our team. If we had a team member that showed up at a reception, that individual stakeholder would come over and say hello, shake the hand, maybe know the first name, and at least say hello as if they've met them before. The second level of it is actually knows the issues. So when that stakeholder comes up and says, okay, we know you're working on immigration, did we get that issue resolved? Or I know that's important, or hey, this bill's about to move through. Or on the reverse of that is very much aware that we as an organization care about this manufacturing or tax policy. And then the third is a stakeholder who answers and returns the calls. So if you needed something, could call them up and say, hey, we would like to talk. That stakeholder comes, turns around and says, of course, happy to talk, sit down, and frequently returns those calls. So this is one scoring system you could look at. The one that we're going to talk about today is a slight variation of that, and that is scoring stakeholders as either supporters, neutral, or detractors. And this is aimed at pushing individual stakeholders into whether or not they support the work of the organization or doing good things. They're just neutral. Maybe they haven't had opinion. Maybe there hasn't been a chance to talk to them. Or maybe they're overall a detractor of somebody who's actively working against the interests of the organization. And the following slides are completely changed from the work that our client did with different individual numbers, but give you a sense of the methodology that they went about using. And what they looked at is overall from the beginning of 2018 to the end of 2018, how did the number of detractors, neutrals, and champions change over the course of that time? So what they were able to do is say they started the year with 42 detractors. 41% of those stayed detractors, 43% they at least got to be able to move to neutral, and 16%, some of those detractors, they're actually able to move to champions. Of those that were neutral, 158, 36% of them stayed neutral, 4% moved to detractors, and 60% they were able to move to champions through their continuous engagement. And then of the champions, of course, a little bit of a better story, 91% stayed champions, 9% of those moved to neutral, and 0 became detractors. And what this strategy allowed them to do is basically be able to go in and show and demonstrate we're making all these engagement efforts every year. This is the outcome that happens with these stakeholders, and that we are actually able to show and move the needle and show that return on investment from the efforts year over year. Now, this is particularly helpful as you think about introducing a new series of stakeholders, because as a new Congress comes in, as new state legislators come in, you've got a lot of neutral stakeholders. And the question is going to be, are you then able to move those into a particular category? Or maybe you see the trends on an issue changing, where your stakeholders are actually getting either a lot more positive or a lot more negative. And this brings and can actually give you some metrics to know a little bit more about what you're doing. The fourth strategy to talk about today is meeting tracking with data. And this deserves a quick pause, because this has been one of the more historical ways to think about proving ROI, and also one of the most controversial of just simply, if I track my number of meetings alone, is that a good way to show that I'm working on an issue? And well, you can log all these meetings with people that don't matter, or log meetings that aren't meetings. Is that really a good use of time? So why take the time to log meetings? Well, first, it's an opportunity to preserve institutional knowledge. So as you think about a new member coming to join your team, there's a world where you want to make it as easy as possible for them to come and on board. And rather than ask about the status of 100 different relationships, they have the ability to go and quickly look up and know the relationship of the elected official. The other side of this is if you were to lose a colleague, it is not having all of that institutional knowledge and relationships walk out of the door as that team member leaves the organization. And so that then you know that background information about the history of your relationships and about what they think about their issues. Second big reason why we see organizations do it is as a communications tool. So especially if your organization breaks down your efforts by a policy issue and you've got multiple team members meeting with the same office on Capitol Hill, it's avoiding that endless problem of, well, we just talked with a team member from your organization last week about a different issue. And you're going, well, wait, we didn't know, we didn't coordinate they were in that office. But also on the other side, how do you then share, hey, we're coming up with these problems across legislators and starting to see and spot those trends as team members are sharing that information across the team. But the third big reason why people do it is the one that we're here really to talk about today. And that is being able to look at, improve the return on investment and the engagement that's happening with a series of stakeholders. And we very much believe here at Quorum that just logging a meeting with a stakeholder isn't enough. But if you add in additional pieces of data, like the issue that's being worked on, the member that is being worked about, the given priority, whether or not that meeting was positive or negative, you can produce some really helpful information looking at that individual meeting and whether or not in aggregate, all of the interactions that you're having with legislators at the end of the day are on the issues you care about and are useful. So what does this look like in practice? Well, first off, if your team's going through and tagging the individual meetings they're having by the issue that they care about the most, you can get a chart at the end of the year of, well, what issues did we meet most with legislators? And what I would encourage you to do is compare this with what you set out to do at the beginning of the year. Were energy and trade, in this case, your two major issues that you intended to work on? Or is there something in here that surprises you of, well, we didn't intend to work on tax reform because that was really a major issue in looking in 2017, but yet we've spent more time on it than expected. And so it can start to give you a sense of, all right, where are you spending time and engagement and what are the issues that you're working to move forward? We work with a client organization who takes their CEO's yearly priorities and puts them in as the individual issues working on. And so they're able to turn around and tell the CEO at the end of the day, well, we did 500 meetings to advance your top priority. And the CEO really appreciates that because he shows, it's clear to him that they're working on the things that are most important. The other side of this, you can of course look at team member of, all right, where are team members engaging? And is there a reason why you see particular team members that are doing significant amounts of engagement? Maybe this person, Bethany Fox on our team, does a lot of travel and goes to all the state conferences, or they're responsible for state legislators. And so they're just seeing a lot more legislators. But being able to get a sense of, all right, where's that productivity going in? But then the other piece of this is, all right, what stakeholders did we meet with the most? So we'll see a lot of organizations, and we'll talk about it in a minute, doing a sort of tiered system of here are our most important legislators. Well, being able to look at the end of the year, did you actually meet with your most important legislators? Or these people have key facilities in the district? Do you have lots of grassroots chapters in their district, and that's why your team's consistently meeting with them? Or are there people popping up where you go, why are we meeting with that person so much? And turns out they were a champion you didn't realize, or a detractor that ends to be proves to be more problematic. And then the fourth and last one here is, what was the sentiment of the meetings? And this really gets at that question, that struggle of, all right, was this meeting actually valuable? And what came out of it? And starting to see in trend of, were we having positive meetings? Were people receptive about what we were working on? Was it just simply neutral? Or was this something where we got a really bad reception overall and ended up being a negative meeting? And what's fascinating is when you start to take this a level deeper, you can then begin to apply these same metrics, if they're all in a centralized database, against each other. So on the issue of energy, are we having more positive or negative meetings on that issue? With our top lawmaker, who are we engaging the most? Are we walking away out of that talking the most about energy or tax reform? Or of that, are we having more positive meetings when we engage with our top supporters, or are we having more negative meetings because we see them more often? And this can start to give you a lot more background information about your strategy, and also for you to know, we're investing all this resources and what are we seeing come from it, and are we seeing the results that we're actually looking for? So if you want to do this, one, you absolutely need to have a system for tracking meetings. I would highly, highly encourage you to use a specialized system. We've watched a couple of organizations who've tried to implement their own system one way or the other. And unless you're really using software built for public affairs, you're going to have a lot harder time. There's a number of options on the market. Obviously, Quorum is one. We've got competitors as well, but I highly encourage you to purchase a system to do meeting tracking to make it as easy as possible. And the second part of it is that you do need to be able to add in additional information about those meetings, to tag each meeting with the relevant issue, the sentiment, the stakeholders involved, and then have a system that's able to help you report on those overall trends that are happening over time. So we've got two more here to cover. So we're almost done, but the last two I think are fairly interesting. Strategy 5 is an extension of looking at individual meeting tracking, and that is looking at the correlation between engagement and legislative activity. So we'll talk with organizations who've implemented meeting tracking and who are looking at putting in place. They go, okay, well, we were doing it. We see all the value around preserving institutional knowledge, around sharing team information. But we want to know, are our meetings making the difference? Are we moving the needle at the end of the day beyond just what our team is putting in? And so we've seen a couple of organizations really on the cutting edge starting to compare their legislative engagement with individual legislative outcomes and activities, and putting together an X and Y chart like you see here on the slide, where down here on the bottom right is the number of engagements along the X-axis. Along the Y-axis is an individual score of legislative activity. And what they're doing is they are looking at a whole series of legislative outcomes. Did a legislator tweet about something? Did they post on Facebook? Did they do and come and visit a facility tour? Did they meet with our grassroots chapter? Did they make a statement on the floor? Did they co-sponsor a bill? Did they vote a specific way? Did they work and were they original co-sponsor on the legislation? And either look at that as an individual thing, or be able to pull all those things together to create basically a composite score of, were these individuals in total actually active and helpful on our issues? And then comparing that with, were these the people that we engaged with the most? And what you can see from the graph here is that those individuals, Sherrod Brown in this case, where they engaged with a lot and showed a lot of excitement on their legislative outcome. Same thing with Tammy Baldwin and Cory Booker. But you'll also see people over here, say Senator Blumenthal or Senator Blunt, where they didn't engage with as much, but also showed that a lower but still high level of interest and engagement on their issues. And the intention of this is to be able to look at and hopefully see this exact linear line, that the more that you engage with someone, that you're also then seeing that benefit, that they're then being more active and more receptive on your issues. So if you want to do this, obviously you've got to track your engagements with stakeholders. You then need to be monitoring all of the dialogue and different outputs around legislative activity, looking at the sponsorships, co-sponsorships, and setting up a scoring system around that. And then looking and measuring at, okay, is there a relationship between the number of engagements that we've had and how that's been changed overall, and whether or not they're actually seeing outcomes that come from that. One last strategy here, and this is probably the most different from all the ones that we've talked about, because rather than be quantitative, this one is qualitative. And this one comes from Barry Schumacher, who just actually stepped down, was the longtime leader of the Government Relations Executive Council at the Conference Board. And he would convene a series of heads of office on a very frequent basis and talk with them. Formerly worked at APCO and a number of other consulting areas. And really, he was wrestling with, how do you measure the same concept of ROI in government affairs? And what he put together is essentially a scorecard point system of a series of, I think it ends up being close to 30 different traits of things, and we're about to go over them. And to go through and encourage the individual government relations leader, members of their team, executives, other people at the company, to score each of those qualities as one of 3 scores. A 2 if their performance was worse than last year, a 3 if it was the same as the previous year, and a 4 if that performance was actually better than a given year. And so what the end result would be is a basically numerical score out of 100, where if they were 50, that team was doing worse than the previous year. If they were a 70, 75, they were doing about the same as the previous year. And if they were 100, the team would be doing better than the previous year, and providing a way to look really comprehensively and holistically at the different multitude of options. So what do they consider? Well, 3 big groups. The first of those were environmental factors. So these were things like increase and deepen contacts with industry groups of importance to the company, increase the number of external organizations supporting the company's policy goals, decrease the number of negative statements from opponents, increase activity within trade associations about the importance of the company, et cetera. And the list here goes on to look at, all right, of the environment that we're in, are we creating a more favorable environment or a less favorable environment? The second group is around social factors. So things like increasing contacts with internal company business unit leadership to make them better aware of government relations activities, increase awareness of government relations activities with suppliers, increase training of internal assets for public policy, ensure timely and accurate reporting of government relations activities to corporate decision makers and interested parties. Looking a lot about how a government affairs team ends up dealing internally with the organization. And then the last big one they looked at were the government factors around compensation, accountability, profitability. So these are things like increase and deepen contacts with elected officials regarding the company policy priorities, increase timely identification of bills and regulations that affect the company business operation or reputation, proactively delay or end bills or regulations that impinge company business goals. And this is more outcomes related of, does that work actually do what we accomplished, but then applying that qualitative measurement. And again, what they would do is go through each of these, give it a 2 score if it was worse than the previous year, 3 if it was the same, or 4 if it was better than the previous year, being able to pull together an aggregate score and even average across multiple individual stakeholders filling out the survey, so that there'd be one place where they could say, hey, we're doing the same as last year, we're doing better, we're doing worse. Important caveat to this, we actually have not seen any organization put this into use yet. The report was released about 9 months ago, and so it's fairly cutting edge. But in an effort to be able to share with you all of the major things that we have seen, we really wanted to include it, as I think it's a fairly innovative way and definitely different from some of the others about going about proving return on investment for government affairs. So to bring us to a conclusion here, before we open it up for questions, what we've just talked about are 6 different strategies for measuring the return on investment of government affairs and bringing metrics to your work. The first one of those, of course, being dollars, about the financial impact. The second being looking at the rate of preferred legislative outcomes as it relates to bills. The third, the stakeholder scoring of supporters, neutral, detractors. The fourth, looking at meeting tracking with the auxiliary data about are the meetings that we're doing actually moving the needle with the people that we want and on the issues that we want. The fifth, then looking at that correlation between are the people we're engaging with actually leading to the legislative outcomes that we want. And then a sixth one, looking much more at the qualitative nature on how are we doing overall as an organization. So this brings us here to the end of the information that we have. Obviously, this is something that we spend a lot of time working with our clients on, and so we'd be happy to talk with any of you if you're interested in seeing about how the Quorum platform might be able to help you, and certainly if you want to request a demo online, reach out to me or the team. We're certainly happy to have that conversation. But really, our goal today is to be able to share these best practices with all of you in an effort to help inform what we've seen and give a menu of options that you can bring back to your organization. So with that, we'll open up for questions. There's the ability to put in via the chat and questions functionality of the webinar any questions that you have. My team here is passing along questions that you submit, so feel free to input those at any time. But I will jump right into the first question, which is how do government affairs teams measure the risk of not timely or effectively identifying policy developments that could adversely impact the organization? Measure the risk and not timely or effectively. So I think this is, so again, question here is government affairs teams about measuring the risk in the event that they're not timely or effectively identifying policy developments that could adversely impact the organization. The best way here is to include even the ones that you're late to identifying on your list of total outcomes. And so a little bit at the end of the day, you're going to have a series of 10 bills or pieces of legislation or issues that you're working on. And say in the world in which 5 of those you identified on the later side, still include those 5, even if maybe you had less of an opportunity to work on. And so in that case, what would encourage you to do is to tag those and be able to say, these are the ones that we were late on identifying. And then you actually could sum up the total financial impact and also look at your win-loss rate, either on those bills or on those stakeholders or on the issues and say, look, the people that we're later in getting to, we're having a worse loss rate, or maybe you're having a better success rate, but likely you're having a worse outcome than others. And this is part of a concept in statistics called cohorting, where there's the ability to actually break out 2 different sets of metrics and then compare those outcomes. And the one that's really most relevant and helpful here is that when you can have those 2 separate cohorts and have a standard system of information, you then have the ability to very quickly be able to run the comparisons from one cohort to the other. So to kind of, conclude, in the same way that you can look at 2018 and 2017 as 2 different cohorts, you also could look at the timely effectiveness of identifying a policy development with the not timely identifying a policy development, and then see how those outcomes come out and have that very clear comparison. The next question is about how to decide which strategy is best for you and the factors that you should consider. So this is a really good one because there's 6 individual ones that are on the table, and they are very true. Should talk a little bit about this, but they will work better in some situations better than others. Obviously, the first one and the first question that comes up is, are you able to get a financial impact about the issues that you care about and are working on? Do you either have that wonderful Excel model? Do you have a business unit partner who's able to do it? In the event that you're able to get that financial impact, would highly encourage you to use that first model, because you can actually then have the number at the end of the day of this is the economic opportunity that we put together and generated, and this is what we helped to return back to our organization or to our business unit. It may not be possible. You may come from a nonprofit where it's not focused specifically on that ROI, and so you kind of have to make that first decision. And then the second one, which is a very easy decision, is are you doing a lot of state legislative work? I think on the rate of preferred legislative outcomes one, if you're not doing tons of state legislative work, probably not your best opportunity to be able to look at the metrics year over year and how those preferred legislative outcomes are changing, because you simply don't have enough data points in the model. And then really what you're then looking at is different ways to engage in stakeholder scoring and in metrics of engaging with those stakeholders. So first off, as you look at options 3, 4, and 5, it's, are you engaging with lots of stakeholders, and do you see that stakeholder scoring systems is a area that can help your business or organization? In the event that the answer is no, I would then say, well, go look at option 6, because that's the last kind of one in that decision tree. But oftentimes we'll see, and really the majority of folks will say, yes, we spend all of our day engaging with stakeholders. We want to look at doing that well. And that's where it's then about what approach you're taking. In that, I would highly encourage, whether or not you're looking at metrics in government affairs or ROI, is to start with the first one of just simply a tiered system of who are the stakeholders that matter to you, and really working with your team and organization and saying, all right, we're not going to go after all 535 members of Congress or 7,300 state legislators, but rather we're going to focus on these people that have the biggest opportunity to make a difference. And then once you've narrowed those folks down, I think it's a really useful exercise to begin to start to prioritize. Are these people in favor of us? Are they against us? Do we have relationships with them? And where do we stand with them? And then if you're going to go and do that work year over year, you want to begin to see what those outcomes look like. And that's where being able to do the stakeholder score a year later, which is option 3, looking a little bit more at the meeting tracking data of those key stakeholders. What are you engaging them with? Are you having good meetings? Are you having bad meetings with those key stakeholders? Or actually looking at, are those key stakeholders being responsive to your legislative interests and advancing the legislative outcomes that you want? That's where along the way, either of those 3 options work. Honestly, you probably want to end up doing all 3 in a best case scenario. And I think it will help provide good opportunities to be able to measure that return on investment, but also really helpful from a strategy perspective. So third question that we've had come in, what mistakes have you seen organizations make in devising their approach to measuring ROI, whether using a platform such as Quorum or their own system? So really good question. First off, one of the big mistakes that we've seen is trying to build out a custom platform to be able to measure the return on investment. So I've seen this both as it comes to meeting tracking of a couple of organizations that have built very complex systems that end up being really difficult to manage, don't actually get what they get done. And then the end result of that is the team doesn't want to use it because they find it too difficult to use. And so they shun the system, and then they're not actually able to get the measurement that they're looking for. The second big thing that we've seen is making it too complex. So we've worked with an organization that we've seen that has just a very complex system for return on investment and scoring, that at the end of the day, even the individual team doesn't fully understand how it all comes together. And in that case, the process not only takes a really long time, but they spend so much time explaining it to stakeholders of, here's our return on investment on this given issue, or here's how we're going to measure that. This is the issues we're working on. This is what you need to do to score it. This is how you need to do it. And so that's where it's really take initial steps that you're doing and take it slowly, of start with just one variable you're looking at, not 10 variables, and slowly introduce that. So those are the 2 that immediately come to mind of mistakes that we've seen. I think the third is making sure that the system is feasible and that there's buy-in. Obviously, if you try and do a financial model and you don't have full buy-in from the business, or you get great answers from one business unit, but you can't get an answer from the other business unit, you're going to have only a half-done implementation. The same way as if you say, we're going to do stakeholder scoring, and you start with all your federal stakeholders, but then your head of state government affairs says, no, we're not going to do that. That becomes a lot more difficult. And so we've seen this with some organizations where we get a team that's really excited and say their local engagement team is doing stakeholder scoring and has all these wonderful metrics, but then they go and they can't get their state or federal team on board, or the head of the team then isn't engaged and interested. And what ends up happening is that you have a slower implementation, and when there's not that buy-in from the entire organization, it becomes a lot harder to see the success, and people don't want to do it a second year and put in the time and energy because they're not seeing that output that comes from it. So those are probably 3 different things that we've seen of different successes. So that brings us to the end. Again, certainly happy to continue this conversation with anyone that's interested. We want to be a resource. We've put together a handout that we'd be happy to mail to anyone who's interested about these different strategies, and basically an individual booklet. We can send that via email as well. And my team is telling me that we'll be doing that after the webinar to everyone in an electronic digital version, so that you can have it. We've also put together a series of shareable blog posts you'll be getting on the website if there's just one particular strategy that you want to be able to send. And then if you want to talk about how this looks like in practice, certainly we're happy to sit down and share with you what that looks like, and be able to talk a little bit more about how your organization might be able to help. And then last but not least, we have been recording this. So in the event that you found this so exciting and you want to watch it again, you'll certainly have that ability. But more likely, if you've got a colleague that you think would be interested in this or could find this helpful, certainly feel free to share it with them. So if you've got any feedback or ideas, my email is just alex@quorum.us. Certainly happy to be helpful, but we appreciate you taking a little bit of time on this Wednesday afternoon to join us, and for your interest in the topic of return on investment in government affairs. So thank you for the time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.